time and you cannot see, I'm going to turn my computer around. Can y'all see? All right. Yes. All right. This is what Nashville would have looked like at the time. I'm gonna go through this without the slides so much because you can't see the slides. But right after the Civil War, as you know, Nashville is under the control of the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army is protecting black life, black communities. The U.S. Army is overseeing, making sure that angry white Southerners don't do us harm. And as long as they're there, we're doing fine. In fact, we controlled about 3 wards in Nashville. We would vote in our representatives. Not only would we vote in our representatives, we would make policies, and we controlled our communities. 3 wards. We controlled. Nashville's divided into 10 wards. We controlled wards 2, 4, and 6. I'm sorry, 2, 4, 6, and 10. As soon as we got control of those wards, guess what happens? Redistricting. That's close. That's close. Redistricting. In fact, what they do is they decide that they're going to expand Nashville and include Edgefield, which has now become East Nashville, and they increase the number from 10 wards to 25 wards to dilute the vote. But they also add a poll tax.
Yeah.
And the voting rolls dropped by 90%. We had about 6,000 folk on the rolls who could vote. By the time they added the poll tax, which you had to pay every year, and very few people could afford it, it dropped from 6,000 to 600. So our political power was taken away, but we developed commercially. And let me go over just what Black Nashville would have looked like in 1930. And this is from the Negro Nashville Directory. In 1930, we had 52 doctors, 9 undertakers, 35 little grocery stores, 5 meat markets, 11 drugstores, 48 barbershops. We had 2 hospitals, 26 restaurants, 7 realtors, 3 taxi companies, 9 public meeting halls, 1 shoemaker, 12 shoe repair shops. We had 34 hairdressers, y'all. We had 5 barbering colleges, 29 cleaning establishments, 7 Masonic lodges, 13 postal clerks, we had 4 orchestras, and these were full orchestras. Remember now, this is before recorded music, so when you went to the club, a supper club, a dinner club, a nightclub, you had to have live music. And white folk weren't playing the music. So we had 4 orchestras at that time, 6 auto repair shops, 1 amusement park down in South Nashville, 2 banks, 14 public schools. We had food caterers, blacksmiths, coal dealers, bakery, candy makers, architects, and contractors. This was 1930, all right? So you all know what happens in 1930, right? 1929, we get the stock market crash, and we turn to the Great Depression. All right? It devastates black and white communities. By 1930, white unemployment jumps to 31%. Black unemployment goes to 50%. There's an 80% drop in home construction. So nobody's building houses. In 1932, we had 273 mortgages in the United States go into default. Then next year, 1,000 mortgages a day go into default. Now, worse than 2008, but you're right. Now, it's the policies after the Great Depression that really hurt Black Nashville. And I want to go over, this is where the story of Black Nashville's decline begins, right after the Great Depression. So we started out in the contraband camps, we started out with some political power, then we built commercial power, economic power, and then the Great Depression comes. And during the Great Depression, what Franklin Delano Roosevelt says is that we got to start housing construction again, because We have whole communities, black and white, living in what they call Hoovervilles, these little tent communities all over the country. So we've got to start home construction. Well, the banks at that time were afraid to lend mortgages because so many mortgages were going into foreclosure. So the banks were afraid to underwrite mortgages. So what FDR does is he says, look, we're going to find a way to get folk out of these shanty towns, out of these tent communities, and get them in housing. And so what he does is he says, we're going to build housing projects. And so in 1937, we get the Federal Housing Act. 1938, the federal government builds 2 complexes here in Nashville. The first one was Cheatham Place. It was for white folk. Everybody remembers that, all right? Then they built Andrew Jackson, and that was for African Americans. Now, after that, the federal government starts to give cities money. And what Nashville does is Nashville starts to build its own. It begins to build Boscobel Heights, which it ends up calling Casey, after James A. Casey. All right? And that was for whites. And then at the same time, it builds J.C. Napier for blacks. Then a few years later, they come back in 1951, and they build Preston Taylor. And then in 1953, they built Tony Sudicum for whites. So Preston Taylor was for blacks, Tony Sudicum was for whites. And that was a way to get folk out of these shanty towns. Well, now you have all these black families in projects, white families in projects, many more black families homeless, many more white families homeless. And Roosevelt says, we still got to do something else. We got to get the banks to loan money. And so what he says is, I'll create the FHA. And here's what the FHA is going to do. The FHA is going to tell the banks, look, you know where to lend the money. What we'll do is promise you that if you lend money and get folks to start buying houses and building houses, we'll make sure that you don't lose any money. We'll back all the mortgages. We'll back them. And so, guess what? They started doing that. And they started moving white families from the projects to home ownership. But guess who didn't get the loans? Not only did we not get the loans, but if you can see this map, the colors in this map, Franklin Roosevelt created the HOLC also. That's the Homeowners Loan Commission, all right? The HOLC created maps like this in every major city. And what those maps did was tell the banks where's the safest place to lend money and where not to lend money. All the communities that were in blue and green, those are the communities where you could lend money. That's Belmead, Brentwood. I could go on, right? The communities where you had a mixture of blacks and whites, that is communities where black folk were moving in and white folk were moving out, that was yellows. I was be cautious, definitely declining, as the note would say. And then black communities all over the country were redlined. All right, and that designation was hazardous, which meant that you could not lend money in the black community. You couldn't lend money to buy a house. You couldn't lend money to build businesses. You couldn't lend money for rehab. And not only did the banks use these maps, but insurance companies use those maps. Car companies, when you want to buy a car, they want to know where you live. And so it was difficult, almost impossible for black folk to get loans for any upkeep in the community. So then what happens to the black community? Well, black communities start to decline because there's no money coming in. From 1935 to 1972, the FHA made 11 million loans. Only 2% went to African Americans. So this policy isn't something that stopped in the 40s and 50s. This policy went up into 1972. And we know even after 1972, there's still discrimination in housing, right? So this policy went for about 40 years. And if you want to know the story of not only Black Nashville, but communities throughout the country, you got to look at the story of the FHA and where they put the money for 40 years. So over that 40-year time, what we had is white folk getting loans to move out of public housing and black folk not. And so another generation in the 60s, another generation in the 80s, another generation in 2000 still in public housing. All right? Not because they didn't want to get out, not because they weren't working hard as anybody else. It's just that we had a policy that made sure that whites got out of public housing and into home ownership. All right. Now, what was more insidious about this was that what this did for black communities is to say, since we're not going to give you money to buy houses, what you have to do is rent. You don't build wealth renting, right? You don't increase the value, the upkeep. You don't build communities renting. So while the FHA is pumping funds into white communities, the FHA is creating a rental market for white landlords at the same time, all right? So if you have that kind of money, you buy that little $4,000 house in 1935 or whatever it was, a small house, you begin to build equity. Guess what you do? You come back to the black neighborhood and you buy some property there because you can afford to. And which is why even in black communities, we didn't own property. What was more insidious about that is that the funds that were used to underwrite the FHA's work, that is to build the suburbs that the FHA was funding, came from taxes from all the people. So we're paying for that. So when black folk were paying rent, we were paying property taxes that went out to Brentwood and Forest Hills and Green Hills and Belmead and so forth. And so while this policy is depleting our community, it's our money that's building these other communities. So if you begin to look at some of the effects, one of the effects that I think is most stark is that if you look at a house today, and this is back in 2021, the numbers have increased, but if you look at a house in a formerly green community, blue or green community, the average value of that house is about $648,000 in Nashville. The same size house in a red line community, one of our communities, is worth only about $280,000. Think about that. $400,000 difference. So, what are the implications for this, of this redlining? First is, white families were able to take the equity from their homes and educate their children. They were able to take the equity from their homes and care for their families, care for parents as they were aging. They were able to take the equity from their homes and prepare for retirement. So when you think about the way that equity works, it builds over time, exponentially over time. That $4,000 house, not only is that $4,000 house now worth about $648,000, but think of all the times you were able to take out a loan on that house to leverage it, right? Probably the first time you leveraged it was because you wanted to send your child to college. Next time you leveraged it, maybe you wanted to build a business or you wanted to buy another piece of property. And think about how much value that adds to the family in terms of generational wealth. So what did it do? It left black families in a place where we could not build wealth because our tax dollars were going to support, underwrite the building of these suburbs. We were left to rental markets as opposed to purchasing markets. Our children oftentimes, when we go to college, come out of high school, we're oftentimes burdened with loans. Because if you don't have a house, you can't take the equity out to send your kid to college. And oftentimes, our children are our children are burdened with taking care of our parents in retirement because, again, we didn't have the generational wealth. So,
oh boy,
that's a part of what's going on with redlining. I want to let me move quickly to this. I lost my. All right, yeah. Lost. I'm not sure how it got lost, but what I'm going to do is I'll talk us through it then. So right about the end of corrective justice is the kind of justice that makes people whole again. So where are we? I want to talk about a couple of statistics that, and I'm gonna give this to you, Dr. Head. I'll give you the presentation because they can't see it here, unfortunately. But I'll give it to you and print it out so in case other folk want to have it. But in 2020, I want to talk about 3 statistics. The first is the poverty rate in Black Nashville. In 2020, 26% of African Americans in Nashville, that's 1 out of every 4, were living in poverty. That's below the poverty line, all right? So that is for a family of 1, that's about $13,000 a year. For 2, it's about 27, and it goes up from there, all right? So 26%. Only 10% of white families are living in poverty. 2020. About 32% of Hispanic families. So 25%, that's 1 in 4, only 1 in 10 white families, and 1 in 3 Latino families. Home ownership is another market that we talk about. 44% of Black Nashville owns a home. 44%. 73% of whites in Nashville own their own homes. And about 48% of Hispanics. When we look at the percentage of folk in public housing, 89% of the residents in public housing in Metro Nashville, that's MDHA housing, are Black. 89%. 9% are white. And there's a reason for that. I mean, part of it is that I did not include Section 8, and we know that generally Section 8 vouchers historically have gone to white families, but that's another issue. And about 1.3% are Hispanic. So I asked myself, well, how did we get here? Particularly in the zip code where I was born, in 37208, how did we get here? I'll start with how we got to Nashville. This map shows what Nashville would have looked like right about the end of the Civil War. All right, large groups of African Americans are leaving the Deep South. They're coming up to the Mid-South. They're coming toward Tennessee and going further north. And they are escaping. They're escaping Confederate lines. As the war is winding down, enslaved Black folk come to Nashville, and they camp out with the soldiers in the U.S. Army. And the U.S. Army protects them from white Southerners who by this time are already upset because they are losing the war. They put us in